good afternoon, good evening, if you want. Welcome to the Culture Matters podcast on international business. My name is Chris Smith.
And I'm Peter van der Lende. You're listening to the Culture Matters podcast on international business. We are on episode number 161. If you haven't subscribed, you can do so now on culturematters.com and some other platforms, right, Chris?
Yes, Stitcher is available, Spotify is available, Amazon is available, and of course iTunes. So that's where you normally get your podcast. You can find this podcast. Also, all right, the topic of this episode is humor and cultural differences. Well, we're not only going to talk about humor, but do you think that your sense of humor is the same sense of humor around the world? And if not, how do you know the differences and how do you adapt to those cultural differences when it comes to humor? Okay, now we've prepared this quite significantly. And we're not only going to talk about humor, we're going to talk about profanities without mentioning profanities. And we're going to talk about love and all that within the cultural differences, or the context of cultural differences. Now, the statement here that I do make a lot in during my workshops is that nothing is culturally neutral. We all know that it tends to be quite difficult to translate a joke from one language in the other, because the subtleness of a joke can sometimes just be in the pun, in the sentence, in the language, locked in the language. But realizing that we hopefully have a smile on our face every day, but what's funny in one culture is not funny in another culture, makes for me the fact that humor is not culturally neutral. Well, if you think about that and think that a little bit through, then if humor already is not culturally neutral, then really nothing is culturally neutral. From project management to international business to international negotiations, even presentations, holding a presentation is not culturally neutral. So what you find here is that different countries have specific characteristics about what's funny. Um, to just name a few, for the Brits, for instance, the Brits tend to have an ironic and dry sense of humor, a black sense of humor, and also they have a typically self-deprecating sense of humor. In other words, a Brit can make fun of himself or herself. Now, if you contrast that with the Dutch, then the typical three characteristics of the Dutch sense of humor is, for one, it's over the top, it's in your face, it's generally considered quite rude. There seem to be a lot of sexual connotations in the Dutch sense of humor. And typically, and this is diametrically opposing what the Brits do, the Dutch make fun of someone else. So the Dutch humor is at the expense of someone else. So is that your same experience, Peter?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, when we talk about culture and humor, and you mentioned a couple of examples on how that is not neutral in a cultural sense, of course, it can also impact the relationship or a meeting and what have you, because of what you just said, right? So if you're making a joke that is supposedly not done in another culture, that meeting may start in a way that you didn't anticipate. So yes, absolutely. Having lived in a couple of countries, speaking a few languages, I've seen it myself. I came from Venezuela and then moved to Mexico, and I was trying to break the ice. Right, I was the new manager, the country manager, and I was trying to break the ice and say a few light things and a few quick light jokes that I picked up in Venezuela, and the Mexicans were just staring at me. And so it's a similar culture as Latin American culture, but even that was already an I wouldn't say an issue, but it took me by surprise. I was just sitting there, hoping that the team would at least smile a little bit, but they didn't. Right, so there's nothing neutral about that. So breaking the ice by using jokes when you're crossing borders and crossing cultures is already quite dangerous. In fact.
Yeah, and to that extent, you could have actually argue that humor is really a serious matter. It's,
Exactly.
it's it's not something to joke with, which is a contradiction in terms, but nonetheless, what's also important, and this is something that you experienced now in your example, even though speaking Spanish, it's understanding a joke. It hinges a lot on how strong or how good your level of a certain language is. Um,
Yep.
if I watch any Dutch comedians, I understand the context within that. If I watch a comedy show from Ricky Gervais or an American comedy show from Ellen DeGeneres, I understand that because also I realize that my level of English is good. But my housemate, who is from Ecuador, who lives here, and if she watches a show like that, she can often be lost just simply because she doesn't understand the language, let alone whether you think something is funny, which is another crucial point. It, you understanding a joke, literally understanding the language part of a joke is one thing, but the fact that you understand the joke, it doesn't make it necessarily funny. So that it's important and good to realize. And there's generally the rule of thumb in terms of how well you understand the language. That is, if you can count in that language in your mind, okay, how many fingers do I have? Okay, well, 10. Okay, that's easy. But how many grains of rice do I have in front of me? If you count that in your non-native language, you generally have a good command of that language. And in addition to that, it's also the understanding of jokes, of humor in that
Yep.
specific different language.
Yep.
Now, that I'm going to use this as a segue and share a bit of my own experience here. Uh, being a Dutchman and living for the last 15 years in Belgium, the Belgians can make jokes, right? They actually can make jokes. And although if I listen to those jokes, for me, it's kind of flat. It's not, it doesn't have any spice. So, excuse me, in the office where I was working at that time, I would occasionally pitch in a joke of my own. And that didn't fly. Why not? Because they thought it wasn't funny, and the reason being is because my jokes were over the top. Had a lot of sexual connotations, and it was at the expense of someone else. Typically, those three characteristics of Dutch humor. So that I quickly learned not to make any jokes. Let the Belgians make jokes among themselves, and I'll just be quiet. And for once, as a Dutchman, which is not easy, for once, I will shut up. So
Yep.
any example, excuse me, any examples from your side in comparison to either Latin America or maybe
Absolutely.
Latin America and the US?
You mentioned a couple of things that are absolutely I recognize. You mentioned the American or British comedians. I love to watch it on Netflix or what have you. Right,
Mm-hmm.
I like Ricky Gervais. I think he's brilliant. Dave Chappelle has a couple of new shows, and they are on the edge for a lot of people. So for
For
a lot of
Americans
people,
in this case.
for Americans, but also for foreigners. So, for example, I like it. I like Dave Chappelle and I like Ricky Gervais, but they are getting to a borderline that some people don't find funny, even in their own culture. But if you think about Latin Americans, for example, and it might be my wife from Venezuela, but also some others, if you make jokes about children with cancer, for example, I mean, it's a joke and it can be a very rough joke by Ricky Gervais, but they don't find that funny, right? And so that's one of those cultural examples. When you mention like it didn't have any spice, and it's the language component of it. The language component is really important. I found crossing so many borders now and working in different countries that humor and jokes is probably the highest level of language, and it's noisy in a bar and somebody tells a joke. I mean, first of all, the language component kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
Think of system one and system two. We talked about that before, right? Is it automatic? Is it just quick? You can understand it and quick because it needs to be quick, or is it system two? You need to process it. Well, it's too late. That's why this article is called "Are Jokes Funnier in the Native Language?" You can Google that,
Yeah, are
and it
they?
says, well,
Because you pulled up that article. So are they funnier in a native in native languages?
well, the article is doesn't say specifically that absolutely yes, but if you read through the article, basically you reach the conclusion that they are. And one of the reasons is that if you're in a listening as an L2, you're processing it as a foreign language,
Mm-hmm.
then there is a reduced communicative competence, so because people are just less good in that language, so the jokes can get lost. they're talking about emotional blunting, which is kind of the what we will talk about a little bit more. But I also refer to in Spanish as sabor, and you refer to it as spice, right? Because you
Hmm.
just don't feel it because it's not in your language. And there's timing, right? So, and that has to do with processing. So sometimes a joke is quick and witty, and you have to get it in the moment. And if you have to process it, the moment is gone. So we will talk about that spice a little bit more. When you talk about the Dutch and the Belgians, it's funny also as a quick side step there as well. Of course, across the world, I learned, I didn't know this, but as a Dutchman, we tend to make jokes about the Belgians that are stupid, and the Belgians make jokes about us. I think that we are. What are we? You know that's better than I do, Chris.
Cheeseheads. That's what we in
Or
Dutch.
gierig, or what is
Stingy.
the
Yeah, that's one of the stereotypes people tend to have.
yeah,
Um,
stereotype? That's a stereotype.
yes,
Yeah.
and a note in the margin on what you just said. When I told this story about making fun with my Belgian colleagues, it's important to realize that my native language is Dutch, and their native language is also Dutch. There are a few differences in terms of what it's like the Brits and the Americans. They can understand each other, but the elevator and lift are interchangeable in within the context. And
Yeah.
so I was joking in Dutch with my Dutch speaking colleagues, and it was not considered to be funny. Now, the Dutch, indeed, like you said, they make fun of the Belgians, all of the Belgians, because we think that the Belgians are stupid. That's just the stereotype. And the Belgians within their own country, they make fun of the people in a province of Belgium called Limburg. And they have a specific accent. I mean, after 15 years living here, if somebody says something in their Flemish accent, I can tell where they're from. And indeed, it's a sweet accent which resembles in tonality more or less what the Irish do. So everything ends on an up. Every sentence ends in a going up. And so if you understand that, then it's easier to understand the jokes. And if you're not used to that, it's attractive. And for me, it sounds funny. So I can make for me I can make sense of that. And for instance, the Dutch don't make fun about the Germans. No, there's still, if there's a football match between the Netherlands national team and the German national team, it's a reliving of World War II. Still 70 years after the date. What is your experience, Peter, in terms of, well, say, Latin America and the context of the United States where you're from now? Who makes
Yeah.
fun of whom?
It just popped up a joke in my head. I cannot help it. It's like we don't make fun of the American of the Germans, and maybe this is not even a joke by the Dutch about the Germans. Maybe it's a joke about the Americans about the Germans. How organized they are, and everything has to be in a certain order, in a certain process, and very strict, and what have you. And it was an airline joke. You and I both have an airline background as well. And that joke was like when you're entering a German airplane, you know it's a German crew because they say like, okay, everybody pay attention, put on your seatbelts, and I want to hear one click. So that's a German joke. In terms of the Belgians and the Dutch, the joke that I just made to you but prior to press the button of recording was, what do you do when a Belgian throws a hand grenade at you?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is that you need to pull out the pin and throw the hand grenade back. And you knew that joke, and then I said, okay, but the Belgians have found a solution to it, and I believe you didn't hear that one yet,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Belgians have found a solution, and they pull out the pin at the factory already. So then you say, okay, that's a funny joke, and people are stupid, and this is apparently true across the world. So because my wife from Venezuela, the Latin Americans, or maybe the Venezuelans, they make jokes about the stupid Gallego, which is like the somewhere in a region in Spain. So that's a very stupid guy, and the Latin Americans are facing the stupid Spanish, and then they make jokes about that. And then you see that, of course, in the United States, within the United States, North and South, what have you. So the regional component always comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there was this other article I just talked to you about, and we talked about it just now. Is about you mentioned like who's laughing at whom, right? Um, So if you go back to that, where did I was looking at it just now, is self enhancing, laugh at self, affiliative, self defeating, or aggressive. So in this article, they're talking about four categories. And it says that Westerners
Hmm.
make jokes across the board. So they do all of them, including aggressive and insults and what have you, including self defeating, put yourself down. And this article says, and Easterners, so Chinese, for example, don't do that. So there is a definite difference. So if you are an American or a Dutchman and you go to China and you start to make jokes with including profanities and insults, etc., it probably doesn't go so well. So
No,
that's something to keep in mind, right?
that is indeed, yeah. That's a good thing for the at the end of this podcast. We'll give you some tips on how to deal with that. I want to make a sidestep here because now we've been talking about humor, um, and so this is a sentence that comes from your corner, Peter, that jokes and profanities, so the funny side and the not so funny side, but both emotional, but because jokes are emotional, they trigger an emotion, and profanities also trigger an emotion. And you wrote down here, jokes and profanities feel quote unquote better in the native language.
Yeah.
And you had a story the other day about somebody like a Mexican that just, when he had to swear, he just had to do it in Spanish because otherwise it didn't get any, that didn't have any power.
Yes, and I can still feel that too, by the way. And I talked to different people about that. So when people are living in different countries, people tend to go back to their native language if they are emotional. And also, if you insult somebody or you want to say something, then it's you they go back to their language as well because it you can feel it. So, for example, if and we talked about the F word and the S word in English, the Dutch use that a lot in Dutch, right? And in meetings
We
because
use
it
the English words. That's what you're saying.
the English F and the English S word, right?
Yeah.
And it's as if it's a normal word. And then I was on a conference call many times in Minneapolis, between Minneapolis and Amsterdam, and they used those words, and the Americans were looking at each other in the room because I was at the American side,
Mhm.
and the Dutch were in Amsterdam, and they used these words, and the Americans were looking at each other like, wow,
You
this is
cannot do
crazy.
this. Yeah.
But in the terms of that, you just said, like, it was actually a Venezuelan friend many years ago who I was talking to about this, and he said, if, and I think it was even a Venezuelan in Mexico,
Hmm.
because the Mexicans swear differently than the Venezuelans. And the Venezuelan guy told me, I need to say these profanities when I'm angry in Venezuelan profanities,
Hmm.
because otherwise I don't feel it. There is no what he called sabor. It doesn't taste. I cannot taste it. If I swear in Mexican Spanish, then I don't feel it. There is no taste to it. So yes, absolutely, people swear differently in different countries. And again, you have to be very careful because you might think that the S word is so common in the United States in English as a Dutchman, and you use it in the Netherlands all the time.
Hmm.
But you can actually create some weird and awkward moments in meetings if you do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have actually mentioned it to me, like, because this is the bridge to, of course, um, in terms of in terms of affection and love, it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, that's a different topic indeed. And I want to say one word before we move on to the I love you part, which is also important to realize that different cultures do actually swear in different manners and different ways. We, the Dutch, use the S and the F word in English in our own native Dutch language.
Yeah,
And so if you look at, and there, I got three examples here. In general, Latinos, the Dutch, and the Germanics. In general, if you look at the Latinos, the way they swear, it is very much focused on family. If you say the P word in Spanish, you're the son or a daughter of the that P word. We have a clean podcast, so I can't say that.
yeah,
So that's the swearing in collectivistic cultures, typically Latino cultures, is very much focused on hurting the family, not so much hurting you, but I'll hurt your family, which is one of the clear things that you don't make fun in a Mexican setting. You don't make fun of somebody else's mom, because that is sacred. You don't that's where you don't go, unless of course you want to insult someone, and
Yes.
then you can do that.
The word madre comes up a lot.
Marde,
Madre, mother,
madre.
comes
Yeah,
up a lot when people are angry and swearing and want to really get under your skin or push and pull you or but also in jokes, but rough jokes, right? So the word madre, mother, comes up a lot, and it's not in a good way, so to speak.
in that context, it isn't. No. Now, if you take it to the Dutch, and I think we're quite unique in that, although I'm not 100% sure, the Dutch tend to swear in diseases.
Yeah,
So we wish you, for instance, which is a clean word, we wish you, but in all anger, we wish you bad diseases like typhoid and or cancer, and that's how the Dutch swear. We swear
yeah,
in diseases, wishing somebody else the disease.
yes,
And the last example I have, and maybe you have something to add to that, is the Germanic cultures, who are the Germanic cultures, meaning Germany and Austria and maybe Hungary, although they don't share the same language. They tend to swear in cleanliness, or actually the non-cleanliness. So if you would say in German, you would say the dog, um, you're the, you're a pig of a dog, or a dog of a pig, ein Schweinhund, which is a dirty animal. And so that is it. People in Germany, Germanic countries, they swear in cleanliness, or the non-cleanliness thereof.
yeah.
So, any examples from your side?
Well, I was just thinking about the words being used in Latin America, for example, where I, of course, lived for 10 years in different countries. And it was interesting to me that in some countries, including in Venezuela, they use a couple of words. And I won't use them here either because in Venezuela, it's not considered actually a profanity,
Mm-hmm.
but they use two or three words. One is the C word in Spanish, and the other one is the V word in Spanish. Well, maybe some people might figure it out here. And they use these words constantly. And when I was there, I was like, "What does these words mean?" So I started to look it up, and they were actually quite profane words. And asked the Venezuelan, I said, "Why do you use this word all the time? It means this." I said, "No, that's not what it means. It's just words like saying, 'Oh damn, my coffee tipped over' or something." I said, "No, look at the dictionary." And I showed them the dictionary, and they were shocked. So it's interesting that if you use those words, of me then going from Venezuela to Mexico, now I understood also using those words. It's not like, "Oh damn, the coffee tipped over." You're using a profanity that the Mexicans were not appreciating. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to be very careful with that stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh, yeah. What? So this is. Thanks for adding that. There's one other sidetrack that I'd like to make, and in our preparation notes it says here, "I love you." Now this also has to do with emotions. Like humor has to do with emotions. Profanities have to do with emotions, but emotions of love and affection are, well, hence also emotions. Now. I think you're the perfect candidate to answer this, Peter. But so the theory behind this is that if you're okay, keeping it to myself here, I'm a native Dutchman. If I tell my girlfriend that I love her and I say in English I love you, it has a very different load, a different weight, if you want, than if I were to say that in my own native Dutch language.
yeah.
And so it becomes much more real and much more true if you say these kind of words like "I love you," "I like you," "I want to be with you," if you say that in your own native language, and not, for me, even though my English I think is decently good, it carries a different weight, a different load, if I say this in English or if I say this in Dutch. How do you, I'm curious now, because we didn't talk about this, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Peter, because you're I know the household language in your household is Spanish,
Yes.
and you've been speaking Spanish for a few years. So how does that feel for you? Eh? Te amo. or I love you, or ik hou van jou.
Yeah,
Or maybe you
it's
don't
all.
say any of that. That's also possible, of course.
Yeah, well, as a Northern Dutchman, I was actually not used to saying these words because why would you? It's not necessary. That's how it starts. But of course, I've been with my Venezuelan wife for a long time, and I really do love her, and I really need to express it. But the sabor thing also comes in here, so you need to feel it. So we use it actually amongst us in all three languages.
Okay.
So I always tell her te amo mucho, and I also put in TAM in my texts. But then I also sometimes I put in IHVJ, I hou van jou, and
Mhm.
ILY, I love you, like and I use it constantly. So and my wife does the same thing to me. So she also tells me in Dutch.
So
So
she trained you well then.
she trained me well, and we can also you can also feel it because we use it in our native languages,
Hmm.
so that we make sure that you can feel it and the message comes across. And
Okay.
I was going to add to that also, Chris, is you're talking about the Dutch, and this is maybe going a step back, but this also popped up in my mind. What we call, I think I can say this, but afzeiken, right? So you make
Yeah.
jokes about other people and bringing them down,
Yeah.
right? And it's funny. And this article also that I mentioned earlier is talking about bonding and laughing and creating some sort of a generic feeling in the room that everybody can do that and makes it actually uplifting
Hmm.
for certain culture. So for our culture, the Dutch, but also the Americans, it's an uplifting experience to do that. And in English, they call it roasting, right? So roasting, there are actually programs about roasting. So they put one person in the spotlight, and everybody is just roasting that person.
Hmm.
And the reason that it popped up in my mind is because we just had this Oscar incident, right, where Chris Rock made a joke about Will
Yes.
Smith's wife, and he couldn't handle it. Will Smith couldn't, and just walked up to Chris Rock and slapped him in the face. And that was a quick roast joke. It was not too bad, but it completely went bad. And of
Mhm.
course, now we know the consequences of that. So even within the same culture, within in the United States, even when roasting is considered normal in humor, still things can go wrong. It just popped in my mind. I had to
Oh, that's good. That makes good
put that in
sense.
here because it's very recent, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's true. So basically, I mean, I'm looking at the time. Also, we are more or less 30 minutes in
Yes, we
between this
are.
podcast, so maybe we can round it off. I think what you said in in more words is that jokes can indeed they can create bonding, so friendship and relationship and making that closer. Or if you screw it up, then it also can create conflict, even
Yep.
if even if your intentions are meant well, then it could even be, yeah, it could be conflictuous if you
Yep.
don't know what to do and how to do this. So maybe you already gave a few tips. How do you deal with different cultures, and how do you not fall in that trap? There's one thing I want to give our Dutch audience, that if you are a Dutchman, and it doesn't matter in which country you are, don't make fun, don't make jokes, because you're going to screw it up, you're going to be over the top, it's going to be too hard, too tough. And in general, what you could say, and you made a few specific comments and arguments and tips already, to some extent using humor in a work setting, or even in a friendship setting. It's like bribing in a way. If you don't understand how the bribing system works, if there is any, then you shouldn't engage in it. And if you don't understand the humor, you should not engage in that either. So I think that's important. Anything else to add, Peter?
Well, you mentioned, so you actually mentioned a few consequence or consequent, maybe it's not the right word, the consequences.
Hmm.
If you don't know what the culture can handle, or you don't speak the language very well, etc., just don't go there. That's absolutely the right advice,
Yeah.
unless and until, of course, you do understand the language very well, and you do understand the culture very well. Now, as a Dutchman, you live in another country, or an American in another country, and you live there for a longer time, or you just became more cultural competent because you listen to experts on the topic and what have you. Yes, maybe then you can start experimenting with it. But you're absolutely right. If you don't go there.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Good points. Well, this is more or less the end, excuse me, of this podcast, number 161, where we talked about humor, but also other emotional side effects in terms of love and profanities. Um, if you want to know more about what we do here at Culture Matters, then go to culturematters.com. You'll find all kinds of articles, podcasts, and our contact details, of course. And what I just added here in our notes is if you are listening to this before the 21st of April 2022, then you can register for our webinar on April 21st, and we will talk about the same topic, but we'll illustrate it with some slides and some visual materials. Now, going to culturematters.com and then go to the menu tab webinar. There you can register. It's a free webinar. It'll take about 30 minutes at what we're doing. And it'll be live, so you can see us performing live there. All right, I think that's pretty much it, Peter, right?
That's it.
Okay, then the final messages here are that if you haven't subscribed to this podcast, then please do so. That would be good. If you're doing this via iTunes or any other platform where you can give a review, then of course we would like a good review. The music you hear at this moment in the background is from Ben Sound. Check them out at bensound.com. They have a huge collection. And finally, I'm Chris Smith.
And I'm Peter van der Lende. We'll see you at the 21st at our webinar.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Take care.